Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, Council. Do we have a first witness?
Yes, it's Professor Robert Heinsch, and his report can be found on page 163. Good morning, Professor. Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Apologies, but I couldn't unmute myself. I think you have to do that from your side. So I can hear you loud and clear. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for inviting me. Sorry for the hiccup.
Thank you. Before we begin, I'm going to have the chair swear you in.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Would you repeat after me, please? I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth.
I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Council will now ask you some questions, and that will be followed up with questions from the panel. Thank you.
Okay.
Professor, if we could begin by having you introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about your professional background.
Yes, of course. So my name is Robert Heinsch. I'm an associate professor of public international law at the Grosse Center for International Legal Studies at Leiden University. I'm also the director of the Karlsruhe-Rieskes Forum on International Humanitarian Law, including its Leiden International Humanitarian Law Clinic. I have practiced international law for the last 22 years in various functions. I have experience as a legal officer at the International Criminal Court, but also as a legal advisor for international humanitarian law for the Red Cross. But during the last 12 years, I was especially located at Leiden University, focusing on both international criminal law and international humanitarian law. I've published quite a number of monographies, articles, and other documents in this area. And in the function as the director of the Leiden IHL Clinic, I have prepared together with the whole team of colleagues this report, which you I think have in your files.
Thank you. So the first set of questions I have is around the evidence that you used to evaluate and come to the conclusion that there was crimes against humanity that took place as a result of the Aban protests. So the first is, we've heard from Justice for Iran, Amnesty International, people who work in both organizations. On page 178 of your report, you begin with the methodology and the evidence that you looked at. And I was curious whether outside of Justice for Iran's information and the videos and Amnesty International's information, was there any other evidence that you used to evaluate and to come to the conclusions that you did in this report?
Well, yes. I mean, as you probably know, and as also as mentioned in the report, this project, this communication was drafted in close cooperation with Justice for Iran and initiated by Justice for Iran, approaching us at the Leiden IHL Clinic, whether we would be able to prepare such a report. But in general, when we are starting a communication, a note like this, we don't rely exclusively only on the information which is provided to us by the cooperation partner or the client. But I ask both the master students who are working on this, as well as our supervisors and teaching and research assistants, to find all accessible, publicly available information. And in that regard, the information which was provided for us to us by Justice for Iran was, of course, an important part, including especially the witness statements, which were translated by them into Persian. But the whole team was clearly instructed to broaden the scope of evidence or documents as broadly as possible, including other NGOs apart from Justice for Iran and Amnesty International, but also reports from international organizations, the European Union, media reports, etc. So This is usual procedure in that regard. Of course, we are no public prosecutors, and I can't send investigators into the respective site. But we try to get a balanced view of the incidents which have happened.
And did you evaluate any information from the state? Because this report does reference different orders.
Yes, so as much as possible and as much as accessible, we try to get hold of information provided by the state, also with regard to justifying the incidents, of course, because this is also something, having worked myself at the International Criminal Court, I approach a criminal case, and this was the idea behind this communication, that we are preparing a criminal case for individual criminal responsibility, that we look at both sides of the story, and not only incriminating, but also exculpatory evidence. And in that regard, we took into account any statements which we found. We also tried, obviously, in order to pinpoint and find out who might be in the individuals who are majorly responsible for these incidents. We had to look at the internal structure of the government and the respective the Security Council, the police force, armed forces, etc. But of course, I don't speak Persian. My team and my students didn't speak Persian, so we had to rely either on translations which were publicly accessible or were made accessible to us by Justice for Iran.
Great, thank you. So let's now jump to, it's page 242. It's the state or organizational policy, the existence of one. And what I'm curious about here, specifically on page 243, in the report it's written, regarding the situation in Iran, it is demonstrated that the state actively promoted and encouraged the attack conducted by the security forces. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and explain to us which evidence you looked at to evaluate and come to that conclusion.
Yeah, you have to give me a moment because the numbering you have is probably a numbering which is in coherence with the whole other documents which I'm not having access to. So I have to find the respective quotation. And this is the existence of a state or organizational policy. Is this correct?
Yeah, so it's section 5.1.2.3.
Okay, so this has changed by now. It's section 6 now, but I will find it.
Thank you. Take your time.
Okay, good. Yes, so with regard to the question whether there is an existence of state or organizational policy, we looked especially at two reports from, in that regard, both Justice for Iran, the Shoot to Kill report, as well as Amnesty International, Trampling Humanity, which, however, was corroborated by witness statements. I'm not sure whether you have these appendixes, otherwise I'm happy to provide them with you. We have here in Appendix 1 witnesses with the IDs number 103, 104, 261, 269, 119, 287, 147, and 284. And in that regard, we tried to get an overview from both NGO reports as well as first-hand witness statements.
Do you recall you looking at any state documents from the state or statements from the state to determine?
I'm not sure at this moment. So we have another source from the Iranian Students' News Agency. No, but in this context, I don't think we looked at documents from the state.
Okay. And then my final question has to do with the intent, which, as you know, crimes against humanity require that the perpetrator commit the, litany of acts with knowledge. And so it's page 246 on my end. It's section 6.1.4, intent and knowledge in your report. And I was wondering what evidence you all use to determine intent. And this is broken up in the report, I'm aware, depending on the act. But if you could speak to that and provide some more information about that, that would be wonderful.
Yes, of course. So, of course, given here the fact that we looked mainly at the main responsible persons, not at the individuals which necessarily perpetrated the incident as such, we looked at, again, reports and witness statements in order to find out and clarify that within the National Security Council, but also with regard to the colleagues, the senior members of the government, including the chief of the judiciary and the prosecutor general, were aware of these circumstances, and that the perpetrators were also aware of the circumstances of an attack against the civilian population, including indications which came from the fact that when you looked at how the people were either killed, tortured, or detained, it was clear that the people acting could have not been doing this without intent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Professor, could I ask a few questions, please?
Of course, yes.
First of all, could I just ask you to turn to 4.2? I've got page 21. I've got an electronic version of your report.
Yes.
And it's the final paragraph I'm just for the moment interested in, where it says, decisions regarding the crackdown were made by the country's Security Council, which is overseen by the Minister of Interior, and were passed down to provincial governors. Do you have that?
I have 4.9. You said, which paragraph is it?
It's it should be 4.2, the government's crackdown on the 2019 protests.
Okay, yeah, okay, 4.2, that's page 20 on my, in my version, yes, and then?
And that's 20 on my version as well, so that this
we have the same one.
Thankfully.
So, can you repeat the question if that's possible?
Yes, please. If you move to page 21, and I'm interested in that final paragraph.
Yes.
Decisions regarding the crackdown were made by the country's Security Council.
Yes.
And I'm just trying to understand the strength of that finding, because on one view of the evidence we've heard, decisions regarding the crackdown were made by the country's Security Council, which were passed down to provincial governors, as you say. On another view, decisions were made by the country's Security Council, but then essentially delegated to governors on the ground. And I note with your finding here that the footnote references one report. And so I'm wondering how confident you are of that conclusion.
Well, the thing is, obviously, as I said before, and also maybe I should say that as such, the quality of this report or the objective of this report, so let's put it like this, is actually apart from assisting you in your work, but the main idea behind this report is to persuade the prosecutor of one of the international criminal tribunals to start a proper investigation. So that means that we started from the assumption that we want to have reasonable base or indicate that there's reasonable basis to start an investigation. It was not the idea behind this report to say we are proving beyond reasonable doubt that this and that has happened. So in that regard, when we took into account in this context this specific report and having the knowledge of how the country's Security Council and government worked towards the governance on the provincial level, we relied on this in a way that we said how, as far as the Security Council has these powers, and judging from what we have been made accessible through public reports, we come to the conclusion that the country's Security Council had to know about this and gave these orders. And I'm not sure you made a difference between delegation and pass down, and I'm not sure what the exact difference is, because you said on the one story was delegating this to the provincial governors, the other story was that it was passed down, and I don't 100% understand the distinction.
Professor, the distinction I make is that on one view, according to some evidence, a shoot-to-kill order is passed down from the country's Security Council. Kill the protesters if it's necessary to clear the streets, effectively. I'm paraphrasing. Which, of course, then leaves little to the imagination or little discretion at the governor, provincial governor level. But there's also evidence which suggests that something more vague was issued at the higher level, which effectively came from the Ministry of Interior, which essentially said, apply the law as it stands, which essentially means you can get rid of the illegal assembly under with certain conditions applying, certain qualifications, such as you have to use other means first before shooting. So I'm just trying to sort of get to the bottom of what you found in relation to whether it's more close to the first or more close to the second.
Okay. So I think as we also have formulated this in our Appendix 2, and with regard to the individual criminal responsibility of these senior officials, especially the members of the National Security Council, we have approached this more from a perspective of an overall order, in contrast to what you, I think, were pointing towards like a very specific order to say, shoot to kill these people in that location. So.
Thank you, Professor.
I hope that clarifies it. Yeah.
It does, thank you. Page 23, if we can turn there now.
Yes.
Just give me a moment, please.
Sure.
No, if we could go back to page 17, please.
17, yeah.
17. And here you're talking about which individuals you've named in the communication as potentially accountable.
Yes.
And you indicated there that the ones you've named are those essentially which have oversight and responsibility for the relevant security agencies or governmental bodies. Am I paraphrasing accurately?
Yes, and I think you're referring to paragraph 2 on that page,
Yeah.
which again references this appendix 2, which gives a list of 9 individuals which we thought would fall under these senior officials that should be held accountable.
And you've included there, as an exception to that, let's call it institutional categorization, or individuals linked to institutions, the governor of Shah-e-Qods, excuse my pronunciation, and that's because she's admitted to issuing an order for the use of live ammunition.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
What was it about the order? Because as I understand that order, what she's admitted to is effectively using live ammunition, but maybe I'm wrong about this and I'll be corrected by counsel if I am, but on the basis that she was defending property and lives. Did you read that differently?
Well, I mean, this justification that the lethal and non-lethal weapons were used in order to protect property and life came up in this context, but also in other contexts. This was, yeah, very broadly used justification. But in that regard, I'm not 100% sure. I would have to further look into the respective pages in the report. Our general impression was that these justifications partly justified that the protesters were partly shot into organs, important organs of their body. They were partly shot in the back or in the neck or in the head. So there were, the overall context seemed to not fit with regard to the justification brought forward in a way that it seemed to be more a protective excuse than covering the respective circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to turn to the issue of widespread and systematic. Could you turn, please, to page 44?
Yes.
And I just want to understand how you conclude crimes or violations were widespread. Are you basing that upon only 2 essential areas? 1, the killings, and 2, the detentions and the what happens in the detention centers, the torture? Or are you seeing widespread in a more expansive way than that?
Well, since we decided to focus on these 3 acts of possible crimes against humanity, killings, imprisonment, and torture, we obviously used them also in order to substantiate the idea of widespread or systematic attack. And in that regard, also following the definition of Article 7, Paragraph 2a of the Rome Statute, I think with regard to your statute, that's Article 6, dealing with crimes against humanity, that an attack against the civilian population means a course of conduct involving the multiple commission of acts referred to in Paragraph 1 against any civilian population. In order to, have like a stringent and conclusive report, we mainly focused on these acts which we were already examining with regard to the section where we deal with the individual acts.
Does it follow then that you didn't look at, for example, the physical violence per se meted out during the protests as part of the constitutive acts making up the attack?
As I said, we, in that regard, focused on, since we had, I'm also, I have to say, we have a certain number of resources, people who helped me writing these reports, and also limited amount of time. So we had to somehow make a selection of these incidents we were looking at. And in that regard, as I said, we were mainly using these incidents, which we also described more in detail under the respective subsections, as in order to support the idea of a widespread or systematic attack. Of course, there was, like, in general, you can't probably completely exclude the whole picture of what is happening there. But since Article 7.2a is very clear about, in order to justify this idea of widespread, or widespread, especially that you have multiple acts, we looked at these incidents particularly.
But also, as I understand it, multiple acts of a particular degree of severity. So
yes,
this is why what I'm trying to get to, which is, you know, you've got the use of a water cannon, you've got the use of certain types of weapons which are perhaps dangerous, but not, in the ordinary course of events, lethal. And I'm just wondering if you took a view on them as whether they're serious enough to be taken into account as part of the attack, part of the consideration of whether the attack is widespread. And just before you answer, and the reason for that is because I'm just wondering whether 304 deaths as found by Amnesty, and I'm not diminishing the horrors of that, but whether that spread across the whole of Iran, or rather not whole of it, but a large number of provinces, could in and of itself amount to a widespread attack.
Yes, I mean, we come here to an important question, and I think we all know that this is can be, or is the decisive question when you're aiming at prosecuting crimes against humanity, the level of these widespread and systematic attacks. And we know the precedent from the ICC with regard to the post-election violence in Kenya, where especially my former countryman and late Judge Cowell wrote a dissenting opinion in a way that he said that the post-election violence in Kenya was not enough to raise this level, because we are talking here about crimes against humanity, which are supposed to be, as the other core crimes in international criminal law, to have a severe degree. I nevertheless believe that the number of deaths which we have listed, but also including arbitrary arrests, and it's, if we can't only focus on the number of killings, but we need to think about arbitrary arrests of 7,000 protesters, the number of mistreatments and torture in the prison cells. So you need to take this into account. But what I'm not sure whether I understood you correctly with regard to taking into account other weapons. It almost sounded as if using water in order to fend off protesters would diminish the idea of widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. And I would not agree with that. We looked at especially these incidents of acts which would fall under Article 7 of the ICC statute and representing possible acts of crimes against humanity. In the cumulation of these acts, we came to the conclusion that this should amount to the severity which is required from the crimes against humanity.
The case I'm thinking of is more the prosecutor's decision in the Ukraine case, or Ukraine situation, where protests around Euromaidan 2014, deaths were approximately 110. Similar fact pattern apparent, which was a government involved in detaining, well, protests around the country, detentions around the country, beatings, etc. on the streets, use of prohibited weapons or weapons used in a prohibited manner. And the ICC prosecutor doubted whether that was widespread or systematic. And so I'm trying to, not that that's a definitive ruling, the prosecutor's view it's not a judicial finding, but relevant, obviously, I think, to this situation.
Yes. Well, if we take the, so I'm rather old-fashioned, I want to say, in a way that I say the then prosecutor of the ICC obviously is making two things. She took like a legal analysis, but she also had to take a policy decision in that regard. Because especially also after the experience with the Kenya situation and many other cases, we know that the ICC prosecutor at one point became a bit more careful with regard to bringing cases to the chambers, to the pre-trial chamber, where she might be afraid of not being able to get a confirmation. And in that regard, I want to remind the panel of the fact that obviously, whenever we talk about numbers, there is a gray area where we say, when is it becoming widespread or systematic, and when is it not? You mentioned 110 killed persons in the Ukraine situation. We have here at least 300 something, but there are reports which go much wider than that. We took a conservative number here. We have thousands of protesters which were detained. So obviously, this is a call which, you have to make in a way that you say, how are the standards of international criminal justice applied to this situation sufficient in order to say it's widespread or systematic? We believe that it is, looking at the evidence, looking at the overall situation. But again, with the resources we had available, and my impression is that you have access to many more resources, and in that regard, that might be helpful. But I'm also saying this, and I'm going back to this judicial decision of the pre-trial chamber and the Kenya decision, where actually the pre-trial chamber said the prosecutor is authorized to do preliminary examination, investigation in the specific case. And in that regard, I actually disagree a bit with Judge Cowell when he published this dissenting opinion about that this was not enough. I believe this might have also come from the situation of him being German, in the same way that I'm German, that we are obviously thinking of the crimes of against humanity as they were conceived after World War II, during especially the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg, where for obvious reasons this crime more or less was very important in order to punish Nazi Germans for the horrible acts they committed against the Jewish population. Under the variant of persecution. However, I want to say that at that point we didn't have genocide in the statute. So obviously, for the crimes against humanity, there needed to be an extremely high threshold. I think the last 60 or 70 years have shown that the threshold is not so high that you need tens, thousands of people being killed. I believe the situation as it was, we found it in Iran in November 2019, would actually qualify for indicating that there was a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population.
Yes, thank you, Professor. On the detention issue, do you make I note, I mean, I might have missed it in your report, but were you able to quantify the frequency of misconduct looking like torture during these 7,000 detentions? And the reason I ask that is because I'm just wondering whether detention in and of itself is sufficient to amount to a relevant act, or whether we need to look at detentions accompanied by mistreatment or torture. And if so, can we quantify the latter?
Okay, these are two questions. I want to say first aspect of that question. I don't believe that mistreatment is actually a necessary requirement of Article 7, 1E, is it E, of the Rome Statute, because we have separate alternatives there. We have the alternative of imprisonment and severe deprivation of liberty as such, and then we have torture and other inhumane treatment. So in that regard, the Article 7, and since you're, I think, pretty much verbatim, have the same definition in Article 6 of your statute, I believe that already indicates that the imprisonment doesn't necessarily have to be accompanied by mistreatments in what form or so ever. It's rather that this imprisonment has been conducted or taken on in contrast to especially human rights standards under international law. So that's the idea, the mistreatment, and that's also the reason why we obviously look at these things separately. With regard to the numbers, I have to say I'm not sure whether from a distance our team could have been able to qualify these because just of the fact that obviously we are happy to have a rough number of how many arbitrary detentions were taking place, but we definitely didn't have the number to say, or the means to judge whether out of these 7,000 individuals, I don't know, let's say 50% were mistreated or not, because that would have required that we would have information on every single one of these 7,000 protesters, which unfortunately we didn't. We needed to hand select a restricted number of incidents where we had access to witness information. Yeah? In order to put that into perspective, we had access to, in the end, 66 witness statements, victims who shared with us their description of what has happened. But obviously, we're aware that this is not, it's only 1% of the people who probably were affected, if at all. Yeah. So in that regard, it's very hard for me to make a clear statement, okay, in 20% and 30% or whatever percent these kind incidents of torture happened.
Is that also true of, and we've got a statement here on page 45, and I think this came from, I might be wrong about this, but it might have come from the Amnesty report, but arbitrary arrests of over 7,000 protesters. What if they're not arbitrary? Because there are protesters throwing stones, there are protesters burning vehicles, banks, petrol stations. You wouldn't include that within this category, presumably, arrests for those kind of reasons.
If they were conducted with the respective, in the respective way as determined by international law, respecting the rights of the protesters, then they would not be arbitrary. Our impression was, our experience was that there was a high number of protesters who, when they were detained, didn't hear why they were detained. They didn't get access to legal counsel. They didn't have a chance to contact their family. They were put into detention center, which not necessarily were the official detention centers of the police. So in that regard, it is something, yeah, I think it comes from the Amnesty International report, and I see that at the end of the sentence, a footnote is missing, which is an oversight which needed to be remedied, and I would have to follow up on that. But this is what I say, that just because, yeah, our impression was from the first-hand witness information that in most of the cases, the respective procedures were not taken into account.
Okay. Thank you. One last quick issue. Looking at page 44 and 45, your conclusion here about the details, and I quote, the details of 304 which have been recorded by Amnesty International, that's in relation to the death, and then you put, quote, subsequent efforts by the authorities to suppress dissent include the arbitrary arrest of over 7,000 protesters, many of whom were subject to acts amounted to torture. And my question is, the chronology you found seems to be deaths and then subsequent arbitrary arrests. And I'm wondering what your view is in relation to whether there's a finding open here to a widespread or systematic attack on a population beginning after the killings and being contingent or constituted by the arbitrary detentions and what happens in the cells. Do you see my point? If we were to find 304 and the way in which they're spread around the country is just not widespread enough and there's not enough evidence to find systematic, could we then go on to find it on the basis of the detentions alone?
If you decide that you want to go that way, you probably could, but I would say that is not with, what Article 7 envisages when it says multiple commission of acts as listed in Article 7, paragraph 1, because that would mean that, and this is now one example where I want to say for obvious reasons, when we have a protest, and the security and police forces are acting in that moment, the first possible act they can commit is killing. And then, just because it's like the immediate reaction to what is happening, and then necessarily the detentions are coming later. But they might take place during those same days when the killings take place. And however, if then at one point the police forces have the situation more under control and start to now broaden their detentions, I would say just focusing on the detentions would not pay justice to the victims of the killings in a way that it's almost against the spirit and the objective of Article 7 of the ICC statute, in a way that an attack against the civilian population from my perspective, can not only be singled out with regard to one alternative which of a possible act, be that torture or detention, etc., because it's a coherent, factual background we have to take into account. So I think you have to take these in connection with each other and can't single out yeah, the 304 killings is not enough. So then we forget about them. It's just human rights violations, whatever. And then we are just looking at the tensions. This is just like a coherent factual circumstance which cannot be separated. Would from my side, contradict the idea of the crimes against humanity paragraph as such.
Okay, thank you. Actually, one last question. Sorry, I was wondering, and I haven't come to a view, even though it may seem I have, but I certainly haven't. But I was wondering what your view was in relation to your preference. If you had to choose between whether this is widespread or systematic, let me put it differently. Which do you think is the stronger on the evidence? That there was a widespread attack on the civilian population or a systematic attack?
Very good question. I think, from my perspective, both are very plausible, and I wouldn't want to choose between one of those two. I see also with regard to the widespread. I want to say we talked about numbers of victims alone, but as far as I understand Article 7, it's not only about the number of victims, but it's also about territorial scope. Yeah, and we need to take into account that these acts were taking place all over Iran in dozens of provinces. So there is this additional factor for widespread. And with regard to systematic, I believe we show that the organization behind that is also rather clear. So I don't want to give preference for one of these.
Fair enough, Professor. That's my questions. And I think that's the questions from the panel. Thank you. I beg your pardon, there is one.
Good morning. I have one very quick question. I'm wondering, in the course of your research and in preparing the report, if you ran across any information that, in fact, the number of deaths was greater than 304. I know that's the number that Amnesty has provided, but I'm wondering if you found any information that perhaps that's a low number and there were more, and if so, what that might have been.
So I'm sorry, I just have to briefly also make a reference to respective pages in our report. No, I think otherwise we probably would have put it in the report, and I see that we say 304 people killed, 300 of whom were shot dead. And we are just referring to the Amnesty International report, which says that the number of those killed is most likely higher, and that the victims include both protesters and bystanders. But I can't remember that we actually got like a concrete number, how much higher, yeah? Whether it's 500 or 5,000. So in that regard, this is the number we had available. Yeah. And unfortunately, I can't help with more insights in that regard.
Thank you.
Sure.
Counsel?
Professor, I have one more question for you. Does the answer to the last two questions regarding the number of deaths change for you if there was evidence or any indication that the state was covering up who was dying during the protests or how they died? So during the times of burials or things like that, if it wasn't documented how somebody passed away, would that change the number or your reliance on the numbers generally?
Well, the thing is, as I said before, it's very hard for me from my office here in The Hague or in Leiden to make determinations which are depending on facts which I only get by relying on reports or other statements, etc. This is the nature of the work we are doing at our law clinic, that we say, and I tell this always my team, and I tell that our students as well. What we are doing is to bring as much evidence or information. I actually want to call it information, because we are not prosecutors, we are not investigators, to the forefront, to those people who are then able to make further investigations in order to investigate and prosecute the people who are affected by this. If you're saying there were cover-ups and there was a policy of these cover-ups, that obviously would make it plausible in order to assume that the number of people killed was much higher. But I can't, it would be unprofessional from my side to say, yeah, just because I have an indication that this kind of policy was happening, we need to assume that probably 2 times, 5 times, or 10 times many killings have happened. And again, yeah, I also want to, I know you have a very difficult task at hand there with regard to saying, are 300 victims, are those enough or not? And I would say even 300 are enough in order to come to this conclusion that it's a widespread or systematic attack. Also, in the context of the overall situation as it happened in Iran during these days or weeks then after the respective dates in November. So this is what I can say, and I don't want to, I know you need more or you want more or you want to be on the safe side, but in that regard, I can't provide this statement as such.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's much appreciated. Your communication is very helpful, and your evidence also, and we appreciate you getting up on a Saturday morning to help us. Thank you.
No problem. Happy to help. If you need further information from my side, I'm always happy to do what I can. Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Good luck for your work, and yeah, all the best.
Thank you.